On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, ISAD, and the Singapore Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, SICI, we are pleased to welcome you to today's seminar on India Budget 2012. This event is organized in partnership with the Confederation of Indian Industry, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Times of India, and supported by the Singapore Business Federation and Times Singapore. To start off today's seminar, it's my pleasure to invite Mr. R. Narayan Mohan, Chairman of SICI, to deliver his opening remarks. Mr. Narayan, please.
Your Excellency, Dr. T.C.A. Raghavan, High Commissioner to Singapore, eminent speakers, SSCCI Board of Directors and members, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the seminar on India Budget 2012, which is jointly organized by the Singapore Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Institute of South Asian Studies, PricewaterhouseCoopers, the Confederation of Indian Industry, and the Times Now. This seminar is kindly supported by the Singapore Business Federation and Times Singapore. India's Finance Minister, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, delivered the Indian budget for 2013 on March 16, 2012. Amidst a murky international situation with both Europe and the US in the grip of a slowdown and crude oil prices firming up on the back of easy global liquidity and tensions in the Middle East, the Indian Finance Minister presented a fairly middle-of-the-road budget. The Finance Minister started his budget speech by presenting an analytical framework to explain the current problems in the Indian economy and the initiatives that the government needs to undertake urgently to get the former moving. Mr. Mukherjee spoke about a number of measures planned by buffering the supply side of the economy. In his budget speech, the Finance Minister highlighted that the budget deficit was narrowed to 5.1% of gross domestic product in the financial year starting April 1st, 2012. This is from 5.6% of GDP in the previous year. According to the budget, the fiscal policy for 2012-2013 has been calibrated with twofold objectives. The first is to aid growth revival, and the second is to bring the deficit down from 2011-2012 level. Overall, the expenditure growth has been projected at 13.1%, with planned revenue expenditure expected to increase by 21.5% and non-planned revenue expenditure by 6.1%, indicating a qualitative improvement in spending. Subsidies have been capped at 20% of the GDP for the next fiscal year and will be brought down to 1.75 in the next 3 years. Finance Minister Pranab Mukherjee has promised total subsidies are estimated to decline to 190,015 crores in 2012-2013 from 216,297 crores in the fiscal year 2011-2012. The budget 2012 focuses chiefly on mobilizing of funds for infrastructure financing and addressing ways to clear bottlenecks in agriculture, coal and power sectors. At the same time, this budget is problematic for the poor as can lead to a rise in inflation, with the service tax having rise to 12%, which will push up inflation since service account for 59% of the GDP of India. Among others, the budget also pushes to forward the proposed major tax reforms, the direct taxes code and the goods and service tax. This is to help bring down the fiscal deficit and overall public debt to prudent levels and boost infrastructure financing. The budget advances financial reforms, giving specific attention to farm sector investment and marketing. In India, newspapers have however reported mixed responses from the Indian society for the budget. Some have hailed it as a progressive budget, with the Finance Minister getting a rating of 7 to 10 from ASSOCHAM, while others have called the budget as inflationary budget, which does not offer much to address the plight of the common man. The middle class also have mixed feelings about this budget. While the tax soaps will clearly welcome their impact to be more than wiped out by the extension of service tax to cover healthcare and diagnostic facilities. I shall not go into the details of the budget highlights. I shall leave it up to the panel of speakers this morning We are indeed privileged to have with us a panel of eminent speakers who will provide their assessment of the Indian budget. They will also share their views and perspectives on its impact and implications on companies planning to do business and invest in India. Before I end, I would like to extend my appreciation to His Excellency Dr. Raghavan for delivering the keynote address and spending the time with us today. I would also like to thank the speakers who are present here today. Last but not least, I thank all of you for your participation in the seminar. I am confident that you will have a fruitful and engaging session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Narayanan Mohan. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure now to invite His Excellency Dr. T.C.A. Raghavan, High Commissioner of India to Singapore, to deliver his keynote address. Dr. Raghavan, please.
Mr. Narayan Mohan, dear friends, it's a great pleasure to be here with you this morning. I'm very gratified to see such a good turnout. I must share with you that this is, in fact, the third Indian 2012-13 budget event which has happened in the last 4 to 5 days. And this says something about both the opportunities in the Indian economy as also the interest in the Indian economy which there is in Singapore. I'm therefore very grateful to the Chamber for organizing this particular event. Occasions such as this provide an opportunity to take a seasoned view of the Indian economy, taking into account all the recent and relevant developments. I think it is important to see the larger picture, because a phrase which I often use, and that is the static from India's democracy. The static is very, very loud. And while it is in itself a very positive and a very good sign, nevertheless, static always has the risk of making you miss the wood for the trees, or the trees for the wood, whichever way you would like to see it. I think some of the comments which have been made about the budget in the previous sessions which I attended, perhaps carry the risk of that particular predicament. So I thought I would take this opportunity to spell out, as I see it, the larger picture behind the Indian budget, and then leave it to the distinguished panelists, Mr. Girija Pandey, Mr. Indranil Roy Chaudhary, Mr. Andy Mukherjee, and of course Dr. Amitendu Palit to fill up the various details. I think at the core of the budget, if one reads the Finance Minister's budget speech carefully, at the core of the budget was this dilemma of how to manage growth and price stability, which were the major macroeconomic challenges before the policymakers in the Ministry of Finance. I think we found ourselves in the midst of these two conflicting demands, how to manage growth and how to manage price stability. The external environment, Mr. Narayan Mohan had sketched out, is well known. The global economic environment has witnessed considerable uncertainty and stress due to political and economic developments. There were significant weaknesses in both global demand, international fuel prices remained very buoyant, growth in the Eurozone area slowed down, and a durable solution to the sovereign debt problems in the Eurozone area remained elusive. The US just about is showing some signs of recovery, while Japan is yet to emerge from the unfortunate twin impact of the earthquake and the nuclear accident. There are also some early signs of sluggishness in the Chinese economy. In India, we saw 4 consecutive quarters of growth deacceleration in the calendar year 2011, with GDP growth following from about 8.3% to 6.1% in the last quarter. This was the overall broad external situation. In this context, the Indian economy is estimated to grow by 6.9% in 2011-12, after having a growth of about 8.4% in each of the preceding 2 years. This obviously indicates a slowdown, not just compared to the 2 preceding years, but also overall from 2003 to 2011, except if one takes into account the year 2008-2009. I would say that in this environment, a growth rate of 6.9% does suggest the limit, our capacity to limit the adverse impact of the overall slowdown in our external environment on our own domestic economy. Nevertheless, a 6.9% growth also suggests that by any cross-country comparison, India remains amongst the front runners in economic growth. I think this overall picture is very useful to bear in mind because, as I said, the static from India's democracy is very loud. Specific aspects of the budget often get overemphasized, others get less emphasis. But it is important for outsiders to take into account the overall context as also the overall, the total growth parameters. The finance minister, of course, in his speech had spoken about the fact that while excluding 2008-2009, when the growth rate was 6.7%, the growth in real GDP in 2011-12 was the lowest in 9 years. This, of course, spoke well of the last decade or the last 9 years, and also he said should be treated as a wake-up call. But nevertheless, there are two factors or three factors which one should keep in mind while looking at the next year and the next 3 or 4 years ahead. The next year is also going to be the first year of the 12th plan period. In the 12th plan, two very important factors are going to come into play. The first is the new manufacturing policy, which is going to lead to great, significant, very important and significant sub-events. And the second is the investment in infrastructure. I think it was taking into this the fact that the next plan period is going to begin and we are going to see significant movement on the infrastructure front and also the kicking in of the new manufacturing policy, that we have to base our projections on what is going to happen in the next year and the next 3 or 4 years ahead. This, of course, will also happen as India will be shouldering global responsibilities of a kind which we have not had earlier. Our presence at the high table of global economic policy is a matter of some satisfaction. It, however, also places new responsibilities on our shoulders. If we can continue to build on our economic strength, it will be a source of stability for the world economy and also provide a very safe destination for restless global capital. I would like to conclude with an observation which the finance minister had made in his speech when he spoke about taking a bird's eye view of the entire economy and keeping in mind the difficult global environment. I expect India's GDP growth in 2012-13 to be 7.6%. I think he made this estimate taking into account conditions as they are emerging and notwithstanding a difficult external economic environment which is going to persist. I will also conclude by quoting again from his speech when he says, quote, "Whether or not today's announcements make tomorrow's morning headlines matters little as long as they help in shaping the headlines that describe India a decade from now." Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I look forward to the discussion and to the distinguished panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. Our first speaker for the day is Mr. Andy Mukherjee, senior writer with the Straits Times, and Mr. Mukherjee will speak on the topic India budget, another missed opportunity. Mr. Mukherjee, please.
Your Excellency, Mr. Mohan, and friends. Well, I am actually going to represent the static from Indian democracy that the High Commissioner was just talking about. Well, I leave it to you. Go through my presentation and then judge for yourself if all of this is white noise or if I have something meaningful to offer. A word on the topic that I selected. call me a cynic, but I had actually selected this topic, and the organizers will bear this out, about a week before the budget was actually presented. So my topic then was India's budget, a missed opportunity, and I did not have a question mark. So when people said, how do you know what's going to happen in the budget? I said, well, I'm sure. If you are not, put a question mark. So now that we are meeting here a week after the budget, I guess one can no longer Okay. So a week after the budget, it's time to drop that question mark finally and answer this question one way or the other. And my answer seems to be, well, mostly yes. Mostly a missed opportunity. Why do I say this? Now, it is not that I was expecting this one budget to solve all of India's problems in one go. No budget is this. No budget is a society's ticket to the moon. So it is very important to keep in mind that a budget is to be judged in a historical context. It has to be seen by what it does in terms of building the capacity of a society. Building the capacity of the society, building its capacity to deal with any harm that might come its way. Now let's see if this budget has actually succeeded, even in a limited way, in reducing the probability of harm coming the way of the society. Now, what the finance minister said in this budget speech, he was quoting Shakespeare, Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark. And he said, I must be cruel, only to be kind. I'm quoting here from his budget speech. So he quoted Shakespeare, and I'm quoting him. But the next line that Hamlet says is even more interesting, which is, thus bad begins and worse remains behind. So when I say that it is mostly a missed opportunity, let me first take a look at the good things in the budget, or rather the worst that is getting, or what is being left behind. So what is being left behind? What is this worst that is being left behind? Before I start talking about the bad that it is introducing. Okay. So this is clearly the first thing, the first worst that is getting left behind, on which there seems to be some sort of control, at least for now. I'm of course talking about UPA's great flagship program called Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Program, or Act, however you might want to describe it. Now, look at this very simple chart here. This shows you the spending on this program as a percentage of GDP. Now, this had actually peaked in 2009 when it had shot up all the way to about 0.65% of GDP, which is a very high level of what I see as a direct fiscal transfer to sustain. Now, it is remarkable that this number has now been contained. So, sure, do entitlement, give people right to work, but be pragmatic about expanding it, expanding the program, and make sure that in terms of the overall percentage of GDP, this entitlement, the spending on it, remains under control. Because this is not the only entitlement that the UPA is promising people. There is also right to food, which is going to come. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. So the good thing in this budget, the number actually comes down this year, and it's likely to fall further next year. Now, is this worse getting left behind for good? We don't know, because we also have an election coming in 2014. So before election, this number might spike up again. And also, please bear in mind that this number also depends to a large extent on the denominator, the GDP. So GDP has to grow faster than the allocation for this program. But for now, the news on this part is good. So you see the farmer there giving a thumbs up? Why? Because this program has actually been pushing the cost of farm workers for a farmer. And it is also introducing many other types of distortions in the economy. If you ask trucking companies today in India, what is their biggest problem? It is not that they do not have demand for their services, even though the economy has slowed. They will tell you that their biggest problem is that they can't find truck drivers. And why is it that they can't find truck drivers? They can't find them because the potential truck driver is now staying home. It's a hard job to do. Staying home and taking money, a fiscal transfer, from the government. Now you can't really blame this person who's taking this check also, because after all, we do have to bear in mind that after 5 decades of underinvestment in public education, in public health, if you today have a 25-year-old person and incomplete land reforms at the start of independent India, if you today have a 25-year-old who has no land, who has limited physical capacity for hard labor, and he has no education, so really no opportunity to meaningfully participate in the new economy that he sees around him, then he will of course say that Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, please take money from the 25-year-old software geek in Bangalore, who has had a much better life than me, and give some of that to me. So the equity principle is not to be forgotten. But we have to be pragmatic here. We can't really correct the society entirely in one go in 1 year. So again, good thing, a thumbs up here for the finance minister that spending or allocations to this flagship program, which is introducing distortions in the economy, but whose basic logic can be understood, is at least underway. Okay? This is the other thing for which we have to give thumbs up. To the finance minister and also to this man that you see here. His name is Nandan Nilekani. He used to run a software company called Infosys, and he today runs the government's Unique Identification Development Authority. Now, what this program is doing is that it is giving every Indian, all 1.2 billion of us, actually not us because it is not doing anything for the NRIs. I asked Nandan that. No numbers for us outside of India. But resident Indians will all have a unique identification number. What that does is that it is an enabling platform. That this number by itself doesn't do anything, but it enables the government to directly give cash to the people that it wants to give cash to because of some reason or the other, usually because of reasons of poverty. But when Rajiv Gandhi had said, before he died, unfortunately at a very young age, while he was seeking another chance to transform India, that out of the 1 rupee that the government of India spends for the poor, only 15 paisa or 15% actually reaches the poor person. Now, that number, the needle on that has not changed in the last so many years. If anything, the needle has changed in the other direction, which is probably out of that 1 rupee now, maybe 10 paisa or 12 paisa reaches the person for whom a subsidy is targeted. So, this unique identification number by March 2014, 600 million Indians, about 1 out of every 2 will have this number. After that, scaling will be exponential. And it is already being used to validate ration cards in Jharkhand. The government is introducing this in many other pilot programs, and it is quite possible that this is going to be a game changer in India if it is done well. And here I must really congratulate Girija Pandey, who represents the software industry, which has actually for all the tax breaks that this industry has taken from the government, it has actually now given something really meaningful back to the society. And for this, the Indian society has to be grateful to the software industry. So this is the budget. What did the budget do? It supports this program, and it is going to run pilot programs for conditional cash transfers, which have been a success in Mexico, which have been a success in Brazil. And people are optimistic that this could start moving the needle on subsidies. Otherwise, this 2% of subsidy, that the target that the government is talking about, that really is not going to be achieved, or 1.7% going forward. I'll tell you why later, a little later. Okay, now, well, those are the only two good things actually I could find in the budget. There's also a third thing which is not there in my slides, and the third thing is that this budget actually provides about 160 odd billion rupees for bank recapitalization, or increasing the government's stake in public sector banks. Now, why is this needed in India? Of course, because the banking system is government dominated, even now, which in itself is an unfortunate thing, but if you accept the fact, of course, China also has a government-dominated banking system, so it's not that we have anything much to be ashamed of there. But since the system is government-dominated, if the government, as the owner, does not increase its equity, then the banks run out of capital to expand. Because after all, banks cannot expand their leverage in a meaningful way without capital. Otherwise, you're going to get a banking crisis in India, just like you got one on Wall Street. So, it was never done in the earlier budgets. The banks in India, public sector banks, do require capital, and by directly allocating money in the budget, the government has done a good thing. Not in my slides, but another area where one can give Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, who actually is not related to me, despite the last name. Yes, for this we can give him a thumbs up. Now here, look at this picture very closely. You know what's happening here? This is near Bombay, and the police is trying to check if an octroi evasion racket is working. Now, octroi is a very funny kind of tax, and you'll be surprised. I mean, of course, the tax experts here will know this, but you'll be surprised to know that even what would seem like a prosperous city like Mumbai depends on this extreme bad form of taxation to provide the very awful level of public services that the city actually provides. What does this octroi do? It basically taxes goods which are coming into the city. So it's a tax on flow of goods, and any tax on a flow is usually a bad thing. And this just leads to delays, it leads to corruption, it leads to fuel being wasted. It's just a bad tax. It needs to be replaced. It has to be subsumed under some other tax. Now that good tax under which octroi and some other taxes need to be subsumed is called the general sales tax, which is what you have in Singapore, the GST. Now, there is no word on GST. Now, GST reform is just getting delayed year after year. There is no agreement between the federal government and the state government on whether there has to be one rate of tax, whether there have to be two rates of taxes, which all taxes are going to get subsumed. So it's a very complicated debate, and there is absolutely no progress. So yeah, so this still remains the reality of India, where the police, which probably has 1,000 other better things to do, is trying to enforce collection of a bad tax, without which the city cannot survive. Okay. So this is from Business Standard, again part of the kind of media coverage that this budget generated. So I will not make any further comment on that. Just that the budget is silent on this issue and also on direct tax code. which is which I hope will probably come out in the news presentation. I'm not a tax expert, I'm not going to tell you that way. Okay, so in this budget, now this headline fiscal correction that we're hearing about, 5.9 to 5.1% of GDP, that is the budget deficit. Going to come down from 5.9% this year to 5.1% this year. That is the headline number that all media are reporting. But that's not really correct. I mean, had that been really correct, had people really believed in that number, then people would have said, wow, this budget is doing a great thing by attempting fiscal consolidation. But just make two minor adjustments there. And actually, I'm making this adjustment not on this number of 5.9, which is just the central government's fiscal deficit, but I'm also taking the state's fiscal deficit, because the states also run a deficit, and I'm also taking the off-budget spending that the central government does on fuel and food and some other things. Taking it all together, and I'll later tell you why this number, looking at it in aggregate, is important. Taking it all together, you now see that about 8.5% or 8.6% of GDP is just getting used up by the government, and this is deficit, which means that the government needs to borrow to really fill this gap. Now, make two minor adjustments here for the next year's number, which is that the telecom license fees for next year, the government is really being very optimistic. Now, those who are following the telecom story in India would know that the Supreme Court has actually cancelled 122 telecom licenses, which the government had, which the previous telecom minister had awarded. Now, the government is contesting that position and has asked the Supreme Court for a review. But if the government fails in its challenge, the government will once again auction that spectrum. Fine, but the government will have to return the license fees of those people whose licenses it has already cancelled. It's not that those 90 billion rupees will not go out of the exchequer. It's not that you can every year license the same resource and then your court will say, no, your method was all flawed, and then you say, okay, flawed, we'll do it once over again, but we will not give the money back to the previous set of banks. No. So if you make that adjustment of 90 billion rupees plus another small adjustment for the annual reporting of, or rather the overestimation of telecom revenues, and then you make, so then you get to that green line. So the needle is already moving up. Then you make another correction to get to the blue line, which is you correct for the underreported subsidy burden. Now, why is the subsidy burden underreported in this budget? Take just two examples, fuel and food. Now, according to the government of India, the fuel subsidy burden for next year is going to come down by 250 billion rupees. Now, how is that going to happen? Unless Iran actually becomes a state of the United States of America. How is it going to happen? Or unless the government actually says, okay, we'll keep our subsidy burden in check, refiners will be allowed to charge more for fuel from the man on the street. The pump prices will go up. But that's a political call in India. And the railway minister, please bear in mind that after presenting the first increase in passenger fares after 8 years, after just for the sin of just proposing that, the man loses his job the next day. So how can you even think that the fuel subsidy burden, is it even realistic to assume that it's going to come down by 250 billion rupees next year? It's not. Take a look at the food subsidy. Now the food subsidy bill, if the right to food project is to be paid for, is to be introduced this year, if the government actually has to deliver on its promise of wheat at 2 rupees a kilo and rice at 3 rupees a kilo to about 26% of urban poor, 46% of rural poor, then the cost of that, variously estimated, is between 300 billion rupees to 1 trillion rupees. Now, in the budget, the food subsidy is only going up by, if I'm not wrong, 30 billion rupees. So you're talking about a difference of magnitude here. between what the subsidy is, food subsidy is being budgeted for, and what is likely to happen if the right to food project is going to be implemented. So, if you make reasonable and assumptions for where the subsidy is going to be, the fiscal deficit maintenance is not going to move. And if it's not going to move, then you are looking at a situation where the debt burden on India is going to remain high. The debt burden on India is in the magnitude of about 63% of GDP. That's the public debt. Now, that's in the ballpark of where UK's public debt is, minus the bailout costs that, because they had to bail out Royal Bank of Scotland, Lloyds Banking Group, so but then they will not always be owning those banks, so their debts will sort of go off the books of the UK government. But if they are really seriously talking about austerity, and they are talking too much about austerity in my view, then India at least has to begin the conversation on austerity. Okay. Now, why is this important? Now, this is important because go back and to my previous chart, and if you see about 8.5% of GDP is going in just borrowing by the central government and the state governments put together. Now, the household sector in India saves about 24% of GDP. That's quite a lot. But out of that, 12% is basically saving in physical form, gold and real estate. Only 12% is actually going or flowing to the banking and the capital markets system, which is available for investing. So out of this 12%, take out 8.5 for the government. This is what the government says, give it to me. That leaves only 3.5% for the corporate sector, 3.5% of GDP, plus whatever it is that the corporates can save out of their own profit. So their retained earnings plus 3.5%. Obviously, it is not enough for the corporate sector in a fast-growing country. So the government has given the companies of India a solution, which is, okay, we understand we are taking too much of the household sector savings to finance our deficit. You go abroad and borrow. So in this year's budget, low-cost housing, roads, and one more sector have been allowed the flexibility, and airlines, that's another mess. Airlines have been allowed the flexibility to borrow money outside India, borrow dollar funds, borrow in Japanese yen, pounds, whatever. And those interest rates right now are incredibly cheap, right? So, so that is what has been permitted. But look at how ECB means external commercial borrowing in this context. How this number has grown over the years. Between 2001 and 2005, the number was flat. Now see how that number has grown. Now it's about $100 billion. Now, it's not really a big sum even now, because out of India's total external debt of about $327 odd billion, about $227 billion is either from, is basically either government debt, and the government of India does not borrow commercially overseas, so it's mostly multilateral or bilateral debt taken from IMF, World Bank, ADB, etc. At concessional terms, so there is no really no problem there. Or it's money which is which is deposited in Indian banks by NRIs. Now that could be a fickle source, but this external commercial borrowing, now allowing it to really shoot up is going to or could potentially become a problem of the kind that Southeast Asia faced in 97-98. It's never a good idea to allow companies total freedom in borrowing in foreign currency, because you are then creating opportunities or threats for a currency mismatch on a company's balance sheet. It's much better to actually develop your local currency bond markets, but to be able to do that, you first need to stop taking 9.5% of the 12% of household financial savings. The government has to stop doing that. But unfortunately, that's what is not happening. So then, the gentleman on the right is the central bank governor, and on left is the finance minister. And the problem is now for 2012-2013 is basically this, that the Reserve Bank of India wants to cut interest rates. 13 times it has had to raise interest rates. It now wants to cut them. If you are a mortgage borrower in India, you right now know the pain. It's about 12%, 13% interest you're paying. Now, the Reserve Bank is mindful that the economy is slowing down and therefore it has to cut interest rates. But how can he do that? How can he do that when the fiscal correction that is being proposed from 5.9 projected and could actually turn up to be 6.1 or 2 because March 31st has not yet happened. So how can he do that if this fiscal correction does not materialize from 5.9 to 5.1? And I gave you reasons why it may not materialize. Because of underreporting of subsidies, because of over-reporting of telecom license fees, etc. So if that is not going to materialize, then the central bank might actually run a risk by cutting interest rates too much too soon. So what the best it can do for the economy right now is maybe a token rate cut, maybe 25 to 50 basis points. Plus, it will provide liquidity. So it will provide liquidity to the banking system in terms of lowering the cash reserve ratio of the banks or whatever it is that, basically leaving more funds with the banks for them to be able to make loans. But meaningful interest rate reduction is what has been precluded. The scope of that has been reduced by this budget. Now, please take a look at this graph on the left and don't be fooled by it, as some commentators in India have been. Because if you look at this debt to GDP ratio, which is the green line above, which actually sums up the bottom two lines, central and the state debt. Now, if you see the green line is basically coming down in recent years. So, how can this be possible? India is actually not on a fiscal correction path, as we just discussed. How is debt to GDP coming down? So some commentators are saying, where is the problem? Debt to GDP is anyway falling. But debt to GDP is falling not because of anything meaningful that the government is doing, but because nominal growth in India, which is real GDP growth plus inflation, nominal growth is far in excess of nominal interest rate. So this happy situation, it does not always obtain. Between 96 and 2005, I can think of numerous years in which the nominal interest rates on government debt was far higher, and Amitabh will bear me out on that, was far higher than the growth rate of the economy, the nominal growth rate of the economy. So what you're seeing here is a misleading number, and as soon as you have the Fed going back on a trajectory where interest rates globally start to go up, because interest rates, government interest rates worldwide are now very highly correlated, it is quite possible that Indian interest rates will also have to start rising in tandem with global rates. And in that situation, if growth also slows down, then you will have a situation where the fiscal deficit problem is going to come back to haunt India, where the debt to GDP problem is going to come back to haunt India. I'm not saying there is going to be a crisis tomorrow. I'm not saying that Indian creditors will get suddenly jittery about, oh my God, are we going to pay, get paid 100 cents on the dollar that we give to the Indian government? I'm not saying that those holding Indian currency will say, oh my God, should we just sort of, give it to someone and get some gold instead or some dollars? So a currency crisis or credit crisis, the likelihood of it happening next year, I'm not saying that that is an issue. What I'm saying is that every budget is an opportunity to reduce the likelihood of harm coming the society's way. That is how I started my presentation. And the direction is important. And in this, that direction in this budget has not been established. So yes, our budget is not a society's ticket to the moon, but the direction has to be good. Harm to the society, the possibility of that, the probability of that has to come down. So in summary, I would say that investors should hope for the best in India, but they must buy a hard hat. Right now, all attention is focused on what's going on in Europe. European government balance sheets are looking much worse than in India. And of course, India also has a young population and a growing economy. So things are still good here. But bond vigilantes change their theater of action before you realize what it is that they are doing. Greece was not a problem in 2009, early 2009. It suddenly became a problem. Things suddenly get out of hand. Okay, so that is really, to me, the takeaway from this budget, that this budget has not done enough to move India in the direction in which the possibility of the society coming to harm is reduced. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mukherjee. Next, I shall invite Mr. Indranil Roy Chowdhury, tax partner, corporate tax of PricewaterhouseCoopers India, who will share with us about the understanding of the tax provisions in the budget and its implications for Singapore companies.
Thank you. Your Excellency, Dr. Raghavan, Mr. Narayan Swamy, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a pleasure to address the audience of the Singapore-India Chamber of Commerce, which I've been doing now. But my task is a little difficult this year after having Andy's presentation and the very nice designs that he threw up before the audience. Also partly because I'm possibly the only resident among the non-resident Indians that are addressing this audience today. And that too on a subject like tax, which is not rather drab in the current scenario, but I'll try my best. What I've done is broken this up into 3 parts and give you a background as to how the tax proposals came up, and we would also just spend some time as to how the investments would look at between Singapore and India. We know the background under which the budget was announced this year. We had the state elections, and then we had the drop in the growth rate, we had the increased inflation, and the lowering of the foreign direct investments that India had in last year. If you look at the scenario, and I thought Amitabh would be coming before me, this is just a quick snapshot of where we are in terms of the growth and inflation, and 6.9% growth is what was estimated for the current year. But if you look at the next 2 years, it is projected at 7% and 8% over time. So this is the direction in which India is moving, notwithstanding the pressures and the pulls that are there in the country today. We had a dip in our investment flows for the current year, around 24 billion, compared to, we just gave a projection as to how it has been in the past 5 years but that's going to pick up as we see going forward. There were no big bang announcements in the budget, as a lot of people were expecting. The direct tax code, the GST, the FDI reforms in the retail sector, multi-brand retail, airline sector, financial services. There were compulsions and the backdrop in which the budget was. The Vodafone case, the single biggest tax case that the country has faced, and it was a big challenge for the revenue to accept a defeat in the Supreme Court, and we will spend some time on that because that has shaped the budget a bit in the current scenario. And the drop in tax collection targets for the current year. That has led to a bit of rethinking as to how we do business in India. If you look at this slide, you will see that the tax to GDP ratio of our country is around 10%. It hovers for the last 5 years, between 11 to 10%. If we have to reach a level of US, Singapore, and any of these countries, this must go up to 20 plus, and that is a big challenge. Over time, and we have two basic tax structures. We have the indirect tax structure, and we have the corporate or the direct tax structure, which is individual tax and corporate. The indirect taxes have in the past been much more than the direct tax collection, so it had contributed more to the GDP. Of late, the direct taxes are contributing to the GDP, but as the service sector is growing, we see that the indirect tax would be above the GDP as we move forward, again, contributing more to the exchequer. Quickly on the tax proposals, Andy mentioned this quote from the finance minister, and the finance minister, those who have watched the budget possibly would have seen that he was mentioning that the life of finance minister is not very easy. You have various players, you have the agriculturists, you have the industry bodies, you have the politicians, you have the policymakers, everybody having their own agenda, and it's very difficult to satisfy everyone. And therefore, and with the economy which is sluggish, not doing so well, it is always the finance minister who has got to administer the medicine. And the medicine would be bitter initially, but it would be good in the long run. And so with that, just to set the background as to what Andy mentioned earlier, with that he quoted this existential dilemma that Hamlet had in his Shakespeare's novel, that he needs to be cruel only to be kind. Now, those who have watched the budget speech would wonder, why did he say that? Because there was only kindness all over. The cruelty was, of course, hidden in the small prints of the tax code, which I would like to highlight, but I would also like to say that that's not going to stay, because the worst is behind, the bad is before us, and we can only move forward in the right direction. What did the budget do for the corporates, for the individuals? It did not tinker with any of the corporate tax rates. It remained where it is, 30% as the maximum marginal rate, with the surcharge continuing as it is. It did tinker with the individual tax rates a bit, but that is not of any significance. But what it did to corporates like Vodafone is that there was a large tax bill, as I said, of $2 billion US, which the government had slapped on Vodafone. And most of you may have heard it, but those who are uninitiated in this, I'll just give you a brief background. A company in Netherlands bought shares of a Cayman company, and down the chain of that transaction was the actual business being undertaken in India. So the telecom license which Hutchison had was in India. And it was many tiers up. Now, the regulations in India, as people read, maintains that India doesn't have extraterritorial powers to tax transactions which are outside the Indian territory. So if somebody is selling shares in many layers up, the government of India should not have anything to do in terms of taxing this transaction. But the government of India did, and it did tax this transaction, saying that in this entire chain, the only substance of the transaction was in India. And therefore, we are not a tax haven, and therefore, whatever transaction is taking place many layers up, the substance of the transaction, the underlying assets that are relating to this transaction are in India, and therefore we have a right to tax. So it slapped a tax notice on Vodafone for $2 billion. The transaction was for $11 billion. $2 billion, mind you, ladies and gentlemen. This year we have the income tax deficit collection of $1 billion in the current budget, 4,500 crores. So it slapped the notice. Vodafone went to court, took the government to court. Vodafone lost in the Bombay High Court, went to Supreme Court. And Supreme Court laid down the law that no, you don't have the right to tax the property, the definition of capital asset does not include shares which are many layers up, and there is no concept of underlying asset in your tax code. So therefore, and also the direct tax code bill, which we have been talking of, proposes to levy such kind of taxes going forward, but not in the current tax code. So Supreme Court gave a very clear verdict to the taxpayer. The revenue was not very happy, and what we saw in the budget was that the government changed the regulation retrospectively from 1962, ever since the Act was in place, through a clarification saying that for the removal of doubts, it has been clarified that this was the intent of the legislature from 1962. And it created a hue and cry in the business scenario, that how can the government go back 50 years and try to tax transactions which are 50 years back. But that's something which is currently being debated, whether the government has the right to do that or not, through a clarification. Because if that was the intent of the government, then you need to call upon the people who enacted that legislation in 1962 to mention to you whether it was the intention of the legislature at that point in time. But be that as it may, the important thing is that it changed the law retrospectively, changing the definitions in the tax code, and so that the roadmap is clear in terms of the transaction, because there's a big tax bill to be paid back. You have a 2 billion collection which has to be paid back to the taxpayer. So these were some of the amendments which the government made to the definition of capital asset, bringing in the definition of property what is underlying asset and management and control and those kind of stuff. It also made a change to the withholding tax provisions, where today a non-resident company paying to another non-resident company should be deducting tax source. That is the change in the legislation that they have made. And if there is a doubt, earlier it was a situation that if there was a doubt, you have to go to the tax office. In the current amendment, they have said that please approach the tax office irrespective. So therefore, it is important for us to understand that the onus is not the individual anymore. You need to necessarily approach the tax office to get a ruling as to whether tax is deductible or not. That was, in one shot, one of the biggest things that has happened in this year's budget. Just to take a look at how the situation was. We've been speaking of the tax code, and we did say that the tax code has not been introduced. But the three major aspects of the tax code, if one were to look at the Income Tax Act 1961 and the new Direct Tax Code, which is in the onward, the vision was to introduce the tax code from 2012 April. But if you take the Indian Income Tax Act today, and what was the necessity to change the Income Tax Act to a new Direct Tax Code, because our Income Tax Act, as the legislature felt, the government felt, that it has survived the test of time. It has gone through some 10,000 mutilations in the form of amendments in the last 50 years, and therefore it's time to make a new law. And the new law basically had three major things. One was the general anti-avoidance agreements, the second one was the advanced pricing agreements, the third one was taxing all these international transactions overseas, apart from control foreign corporation regulations. Now, three of the four are already in this current year's budget proposal. So in effect, in substance, I would think that the direct tax code is in place from April 1, 2012, although in reality, it would come up later on. The direct tax code, of course, it went through serious rounds of debates in the country, and we have the standing committee of the parliamentarians who have given their recommendations on the various aspects of the tax code. And on the indirect transfer, the recommendations of the Standing Committee for Finance are three major ones. One, that it should exempt the small undertakings. Two, it should exempt the listed shares in the stock exchange. And 3, it should exempt internal reorganization. So hopefully, when the budget gets passed, as this is just a proposal, when it gets passed, these 3 recommendations would be considered by the government to bring sanity to the retroactive amendment. The second important part, which I mentioned, was the general anti-avoidance agreement, which the government has brought into the budget. So far, we had specific anti-avoidance arrangements like the transfer pricing laws, etc. It is now brought in the tax code to say that the government will not permit impermissible avoidance agreements. By that, it means that if your main purpose, or one of the main purposes, is to avoid tax, then it would be impermissible. Government has the right to invoke general anti-avoidance. And it should be, along with the main purpose of avoiding, one of the 4 conditions must be also fulfilled, that it must also not have commercial substance, it would not be for bona fide purpose, the main purpose would be to abuse the tax provisions, and one of the criteria must be satisfied along with that. The way it would be enforced is that there are concerns with that it's a highly pervasive, it can always tax genuine transactions. What would be the impact on the past transactions because of the enactment of GAR? Also, the GAR provisions provide for a limited treaty override, that when you have bilateral treaty, it's the responsibility of the 2 governments to honor the treaty. Now, if the government were to invoke general anti-avoidance, then the treaty would be overridden and they would not be allowing the treaty provisions. So there are concerns on GAR. And again, the Parliamentary Standing Committee did deliberate on this and came up with certain recommendations which hopefully, when the government would be introducing the budget in the Parliament, would be considering that. Some of these recommendations we put up here, that the applicability should be prospective, which the government is doing. The onus should be on the tax authorities to prove that there is a tax avoidance. Today, as the law stands, the onus is on the individual taxpayer to prove that it is not doing any impermissible transaction. The composition of the GAR panel, this is how it's going to work, that if a tax officer in India feels that there is an anti-avoidance, there's an avoidance of tax, he has to refer the matter to the commissioner, and the commissioner would then decide on whether there is an applicability required here or not. If the taxpayer challenges before the commissioner, then the commissioner would refer it to a higher body comprising of 3 other commissioners. Now, the recommendation of the Standing Committee is to make it at the level of Chief Commissioner, 1 Chief Commissioner along with 2 independent technical persons. And of course, the recommendation from the Standing Committee is that it should not override the treaty, because we must honor the sovereign jurisdictions, whatever. On the withholding provisions, there have been certain changes. The government's intention is clear again, to tax certain transactions in the nature of software as royalties. It also intends to tax certain transmission expenses, which there's been a lot of litigation going on. And these are again through retrospective amendments, and these are expected that it would be carried out in the budget by changing the definition of the Income Tax Act in the treaty. To prevent treaty abuse, the government is trying to enforce today that the tax residency certificate is now a must, and one must get the tax residency certificate from the jurisdictions. The government will provide necessary guidelines in the form and manner in which such residency certificates would have to be obtained, which is again in